Hey everybody, it is Sean Gibbons. I'm coming to you from conference room 2A at network headquarters. That sounds fancy, but it's a small room with really funky wallpaper, and we're delighted to be with you. Thanks for being along with us on a hot June afternoon. At least it's hot where we are in Washington, D.C. I'm with Dan Gerstein and my colleague Tristan Mahabir, and we're going to spend the next hour talking to you about how to go from thought leader to successful author. As I mentioned, Dan is with us in the room. He came down from New York today. He's president of Gotham Ghostwriters. Anybody thought that was Gotham Ghostwriters? Got that totally wrong. It's Gotham Ghostwriters. Dan, sorry, that's an inside joke, guys. Dan has helped broker more than 300 successful collaborations and advised scores of thought leaders on how to produce a rewarding book. And drawing on this extensive experience, he's going to spend the next hour providing a strategic roadmap on how to become a successful author. Now, why are you here? My guess is you're at least remotely curious about how this works, and it works a lot more often than you might think. So, for instance, I hope perhaps if you're part of the network, you've seen Cecile Richards is planning to join us at ComNet 18 this fall in San Francisco, and we're really thrilled to have her. She has a brand new book out called Making Trouble. As Dan just shared with me, Cecile is an extraordinary leader and incredibly busy, and she had a ghostwriter work with her. As a matter of fact, it was her former writing partner at Planned Parenthood, the chief speechwriter there, a woman by the name of Lauren Peterson. And to Cecile's great credit, and this is becoming more and more common, she is acknowledged on the cover of the book, and she has been part of the book tour, and Cecile and Lauren are sharing the credit for this extraordinary achievement of sharing Cecile's story and helping people understand the journey that she's been on and some of the wisdom that she's picked up along the way. And I think that's one of the things you try to do with the book. So my guess is that's probably something you're thinking about with your boss, or perhaps for yourself, is how can a book take some ideas that have been sort of noodling around in my head, force me to think about them in a really rigorous way, put them together in a way that's going to resonate with others, and then bring it out into the world. And that's largely what we're going to be covering over the next hour. We're going to talk about writing, how to find someone, first of all, and then hire and work with a ghostwriter. It's a slightly different enterprise than just sitting down by your lonesome in front of a screen. We're going to talk about publishing. So what factors do you need to consider in choosing between traditional publishing, going down to Random House or whomever, or self-publishing on Medium or through Amazon or whatever it might be? And then thinking a little bit about even the marketing aspects of this. What concrete steps can you take to find an audience and maximize the impact of your book so that, who knows, maybe you end up talking to Jimmy Kimmel, or you're on the Today Show, or any number of other outlets that regularly have authors with big books out.
Or you're the guest at ComNet 2019. That's
also
keynote.
A possibility. I guess that's true. Yeah, that's become a destination. We're going to have a couple of great authors with us, not only Cecile, but also Henry Timms and Jeremy Hymans, who wrote a really fantastic book called New Power. We're excited to share that with you all. Now, this is the part where I do a little bit of the technical stuff, a couple logistical things. We're going to be taking your questions throughout the presentation. So if you've been with us before, you know the drill. You go down to the lower left-hand corner of the screen that you're looking at right now if you're on the webinar technology, and there's a chat box. I think it's even called participant feedback. You just type in your question there. Tristan and I are looking at them, and along the way, we'll take a couple points there to stop and pause and take your question. We're also, Yabby, our colleague, is upstairs, and she is live tweeting this. She's going to be looking for your questions, and we'll be taking questions from there. The hashtag that we use on Twitter is ComNetLive, and just to make sure we check everyone's spelling, that's ComNetlive, hashtag ComNetLive. As always, this webinar is being recorded so that Dan and I can listen to it later and go, oh my God, I wish I said that differently. But we are going to post it online just the same, even if we goof up. At comnetwork.org, and it'll be up there and also on our new YouTube channel for free replays, so look for that in the next couple of days. I guess with that, I'll be handed off to Dan. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we're going to have some fun. Dan?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for having me. So our agency, Gotham Ghostwriters, has a front row seat to two really interesting, dynamic, and I think ultimately positive trends. One is the democratization of publishing, right, with the evolution of digital technologies and the lowering costs of distributing content and the rise of a whole new publishing marketplace. Pretty much anyone can write and publish a book these days. And for the bulk of people who are thought leaders and may have a narrow audience or a very niche subject, that's really exciting. It creates all kinds of opportunities. But what also, the flip side of it is, it's a very, very crowded marketplace. And so then the question is, so, you know, you can get your book written, you can get your book published, but how do you get it noticed, right? How do you have it serve your larger purposes? Because more and more for thought leaders, and this is the second trend that we've been noticing, is that the book is the new business card for thought leadership. It's the badge of credibility and a foundation for people who want to have a platform to share their ideas, get better known, get more influence, and create a virtuous cycle where they have not just a voice in the debate, but can influence a national and increasingly an international conversation. So my goal today is to kind of talk to you through a little bit, and make this as informative as possible, about you know, if you're going to make this decision, how you make the decision in a way that's going to ensure that you're doing this, that's going to lead to success, right? It's going to achieve the goals you want. Secondly, give you a little bit more of a primer about how publishing and the ghostwriting markets work, because they're very opaque and insular and hard to penetrate and understand from the outside. And then third, to kind of then talk specifically about how you make decisions about whether to hire a ghostwriter, and if you do, how you're going to structure that. Secondly, what's the right publishing path for you? And third, how to be thinking about getting visibility for the book and the ideas and the author, whether it's you or the boss you're working with. So to start with, the big idea that I will throw out there, and I think it should kind of frame this entire conversation in any kind of consideration of pursuing writing and publishing a book, which is the book is a pop-up business. And like if you're going to launch any kind of business, you've got to be prepared, right? You have to be thinking about, like, you're committed to this, and you have the resources necessary to do it, right? So, you know, I use this quick distillation of how to think about the, you know, the publishing opportunities, right? It's the tale of two cities is what I was getting at before. It's never been easier to publish. It's never been harder to stand out and get traction for your book, right? So if you're going to do this, it's going to, you know, be a major investment, both of energy, time, and potentially money, right? So the first question that I always, you know, encourage people to be thinking about is, you know, the timing, right? Is this the right time to be going out and thinking about writing and publishing a book? And, you know, the quick three-pronged approach I advise taking is, are you ready? Do you have something to say, right? Are you sure that, like, you have your ideas down and you're in a position to kind of put something into a book that's going to represent your ideas in a reputation-enhancing way? Secondly, are you willing, right? Are you committed to doing this? Writing a book is really hard, even if you're not writing the whole book yourself. Producing a book takes a lot of emotional energy as well as time, and that's one of the things that we've discovered in a lot of the clients who are coming to us. You know, one of the first things to say is, I tried to start writing the book myself, but it was really, really hard, and I got stuck, or I didn't have the time. And that's a big reason why even people who are actually decent writers themselves end up trying to hire a collaborator, is because it's really, really challenging, and getting the benefit of professional experience and expertise can be really make a huge, huge difference, right? And then the last prong of this is able, right? Ready, willing, and able. And able to me means you have the resources necessary, right? And again, pop-up business. Do you have the resources, whether to write the book yourself or to, you know, to hire a ghostwriter? Do you have the capital necessary to, and it's not just financial capital, it's institutional capital. Is your organization prepared to support you as an author and help push this product out in the marketplace, okay? So if you feel like you've got all three of those boxes checked, you're ready, willing, and able, right? Then the next most important question, and it's the first question I always ask the clients who come to us, because most of them have already kind of crossed that threshold, and they say, I want to write a book, I'm ready. The big question is why, right? You have to kind of be clear about your mission, because every decision you make will flow from that. So starting off, what's your goal, right? What do you want to accomplish by publishing this book? Now, it could be just that you want to have the book, so it's listed on your author, your published author, it's listed on your webpage. You may want want to have it so you get more speaking gigs, so you can raise your visibility. There's lots of different justifications for it, but before you're going to start constructing a business plan for this pop-up business, it's important to know, okay, what's the objective here? And then secondly, what can I realistically expect to accomplish, okay? A lot of authors that we deal with, one of the first questions they ask is like, I want to get on the New York Times bestseller list, right? Hear it over and over again. Very few people in the serious nonfiction space get on the New York Times bestseller list. That does not mean your book isn't worth doing. It's just that it's a big, big challenge, and unless you have, 1 million Twitter followers, or you're on CNBC on a regular basis, or, you're doing 100 paid speaking gigs a year, if you don't have a major platform and already a preset, brand recognition for you and or your organization, it's really challenging. So again, to go in with your eyes open about what you can realistically accomplish by publishing a book. And then the third part of it is just what does success look like, okay? So if you're not going to be a New York Times bestseller and you have a realistic expectation, to kind of think through, okay, if I accomplish X, will I be happy, right? And to have that kind of like, clarity. When I was a speechwriter the goal was always to think about what's your headline you want in the Washington Post, New York Times when you're working on the Hill or your boss gives a big speech. And to be thinking in kind of those terms for like, what's the outcome you'd want from doing this?
And so if it's not the New York, sorry to take the privilege here, Dan, but if it's not the New York Times, what's a secondary reasonable goal that says, yeah, I am going to go through the process of building this pop-up business and maybe engaging with a ghostwriter? Like, what's that second or sort of third level of success that you hear sometimes people come to that conclusion and say, you know what, that's good enough, or that's where we really do need to be. That's how we want to position ourselves.
I'll do my best to try and relate it directly to this audience. It could be growing your donor base by 20%, right? The book is a marketing vehicle for the organization, its brand, and the founder or CEO's leadership. And if that can serve as a way to advance the organization's mission, there are some metrics you can use to sort of say this had an impact, right? So that would be number one. Number two is do the ideas penetrate, right? So a lot of people use a book to put a stake in the ground and sort of say, I'm going to take ownership, not just of this issue, but an idea that we want to influence the conversation. And again, there's ways to measure is like, does your idea get pickup at discussions at conferences within your field? Is it quoted in specialty press that covers your issue or your arena?
Okay.
So once you kind of cross those two thresholds and you have a sense of, okay, I'm ready to do this, and I have clarity on the mission, right? The second piece of this is doing market research, right? Is before you're going to launch your pop-up business, thinking about, okay, I got to have a better understanding of this marketplace that I'm about to be entering, okay? So for this purpose of this conversation, I'm going to focus on two key elements. So one is the actual writing of the book, the editorial process, and the second is the publishing marketplace, right? How you get your book physically produced and distributed and get out into the marketplace, all right? So starting with the ghostwriting market, which is, our foremost area of expertise. As Sean was alluding to with talking about the Cecile Richards project, the stigma that used to be there with ghostwriting is rapidly melting away, and I think the internet is responsible a lot for that. I'm guessing that a lot of you guys know who Jon Favreau is, right?
Mm-hmm. One of the speechwriter for President Obama.
Speechwriter for President Obama. A generation ago, that never would have happened. As a matter of fact, he probably would have got fired for, claiming credit or being identified.
Well, but Peggy Newman, right? Noonan.
Yeah.
Right, is another high profile.
So that happened a little bit more after she left the White House.
Fair enough.
Yeah. But yeah, so the internet, everything's become transparent. Everyone knows that the president has a speechwriter, that Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, became famous as an author, that Lee Iacocca, these people use writers, right? Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that, just like there's nothing wrong with using an accountant to do your taxes. By one estimate now, 70% of nonfiction books have either a ghostwriter or a collaborator or some form of writing partner where the name author didn't do the bulk of the writing themselves. Okay?
And is that kind of the preferred way to think about it, as a writing partner or a ghostwriter? Because I forgive my lack of understanding what the nomenclature is here.
It's a great question. And we use ghostwriter as a kind of an umbrella term to cover actually several kinds of collaborators, right? So a true ghostwriter is someone who writes the book, gets no public credit, no public recognition, and does all the writing themselves, right? That's sort of like the strict kind of sense of a ghostwriter. And then there's collaborators, like who are a true partner with the author, and in that they're not just helping with the writing, but they're a thought partner, and they're contributing to the intellectual architecture of the book. And then there's, kind of a separate category of editorial coaches and strategists, people who help the author think about the concept and the framework of the book, and then help them massage the text and make it better than what the author could do on their own. And this gets to a very important point, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the third section, about, there are going to be plenty of the people that you work with, your bosses, your colleagues, who are going to be thinking about this, and they're going to want to write the book themselves, right? So I'm not going to presume that everyone's going to use, quote, unquote, a ghostwriter. But the reality is a lot of people, as you go up and they're more busy, whether they're a good writer or not, it's the practical challenge of writing a book. Unless they're going to take a 6-month sabbatical, they're going to need some help. And then the question is, what kind of help? And that's part of this kind of evaluation process, and thinking about this as a, having a business plan is like, what are my needs as an author, right? And what's going to work best for me? Is it going to be someone who's going to be the real ghostwriter writing the whole text? Is it going to be someone who's more of a thought partner and collaborator? Or is it going to be, I'm going to do the bulk of the actual writing of the text. I'm going to work night and weekends, and then this person's going to help me make it sing. Mm-hmm. Okay? To that point, with the changes in the economy, particularly in the journalism landscape, there are never been as many great options out there for editorial talent, for writing partners and collaborators. There are so many really, really talented people out there that are doing this on an everyday basis, okay? So that the talent pool is there. The challenge, of course, the term of ghostwriting is self-evident, is there's not really an open marketplace for this. It's not standardized at all. And just the idea of finding writers can be very, very challenging. So in New York, people who are plugged into the publishing world, they have access to publishing houses and literary agents. That's, they have the benefit of leveraging that infrastructure to find someone. But if you're not in New York or LA, the chances are the number one way you're going to look for a ghostwriter is on Google, right? And when you do that, there's a lot of risk, right? Because there's not a proven system for vetting people, for, getting a sense of their reliability, let alone their competence and their skill set.
There's no Angie's list for ghostwriters.
Well, there are. That's the thing is,
that's what you guys do.
Well, to some degree, right? That's a void that our agency has tried to fill in the marketplace, is to be in a position where we can kind of curate and do customized search and placement of writers who are well aligned. But there are other sources that people can go to, right? There are collectives online. There are boutique agencies. And so we'll get to that in a little bit in terms about how you search. But, it's often, the other part of it is not only is it risky, it can take a lot of time. So that's just a key point to bear in mind, is that if you're going to do this on your own, or you're not going to necessarily work through an agency like ours, I hope you would consider that, obviously, but that you got to dedicate time to doing research and screening, okay? Mm-hmm. Because, again, it's not just the financial commitment of hiring someone. It's a very intimate relationship, and you're placing a lot of trust in this person because, you're, in many cases, authors are putting their life's work and reputation on the line. So due diligence is incredibly, incredibly important. We talked a little bit about sort of, who does what, and where to find candidates. One of the things that we encourage people to do is, if they're thinking about trying to find a literary agent, right? So the most common tactic is to go look at books you like and look in the acknowledgement pages to say, I want to thank my agent, right? Because that's a good way to start with a starting point to sort of say they've represented similar books that have been successful. There's a similar tactic to use in terms of looking for ghostwriters and collaborators. You go to the acknowledgements pages. In most cases, if the book, there was a ghostwriter or collaborator, they're mentioned in the acknowledgements pages. And that's a really great way to kind of start building a list of people that you might want to consider because A, you know they've done comparable books, and B, it turned out well.
Right.
Right. So that I find is actually a far better method for,
and when you're looking at acknowledgements, would they say, bluntly, Karen Smith was the co-author of this book? Or
in some cases, yes. They won't necessarily use co-author because that's a term of art for what you get credit on the cover. But they will make clear that this person was instrumental in the development of the book, right? Mm-hmm. And that's funny because it's actually in the contracts we develop for the writers we work with, that is specified in the contract. Is that
how they'll be acknowledged.
Exactly, right. And that's something to be negotiated. Then there's the question of pricing, and this is one of the things that, obviously it's one of the first questions we get asked, how much does it cost? The reality is there's a huge, huge range, and that's a big part because it's opaque. People don't discuss how much they're paid. There's no list on the internet you can find really. But because we broker so many deals and you're talking to both authors and writers, we actually probably have a better sense of the marketplace than anyone else. And, for the most case, for thought leadership books, the low end, you're talking $30,000 to $40,000 to hire a writer who's going to take the lead in the writing process, upwards of $300,000, even $400,000, right? Wow. So it's a very, very big range, and a lot of it is driven by what the writer can command on the open market. Okay, and there's several elite writers in our network, whether they've written New York Times bestsellers or not, they're very accomplished and they're in demand, and therefore they have the luxury to sort of say, this is what I charge, and they have the freedom to say no. And then the last thing to be thinking about in terms of understanding this marketplace is first and foremost, having a contract is essential, right? There has to be sort of a document that spells out who's responsible for what. There's clarity of expectations, and there are guardrails for the relationship because, again, it's a very intimate thing, and a lot of it is dependent, it's subjective about what the writer's contributing to it. Being able to evaluate, it's not like hiring a plumber. Does your faucet fix it work at the end of the day? So being clear about sort of what the author's expectations are, because at the end of the day, if the founder and president of a nonprofit is hiring a writer to work with them, that writer has an audience of one, right? That they're being hired by the principal, by the author, and if the author's satisfied, they've done a good job. Mm-hmm. And by far the most sensitive part of the contract and the thing that you have to really pay most attention to is the termination clause, right? You're hoping for the best, but you got to be prepared for the worst. So having language in there that addresses certain scenarios at different points of the collaboration is super important. So at that point, before we jump into the primer of the publishing market, do you want to take some questions?
Yeah, I put it up there. Guys, do you have any questions? We have a little place for you to jump in. I guess while we're waiting for folks to type in, and you can go again, just as a reminder, that lower left-hand chat box, and I'm looking on Twitter as well to see if you have any questions coming through. What's the thing that's changed the most, beyond the fact that there's greater transparency? What's the thing that you've seen in the time that you've been in business? What's shifted most within the publishing industry with regard to this particular craft of writers, authors, I guess the name's at the front of the book, and writers, people maybe doing a lot of the work, working together? How has that shifted beyond the fact that now they're getting perhaps more recognition, the writers are?
I would say first and foremost it's just been the growth in the service providers. There are so many more freelance writers who are now writing books. Secondly,
and is there a profile for these people? Are they like the woman who worked with Seal Richards? Are they former speechwriters? Are they former journalists? Are they?
All of the above. Then there are certain people who will do books occasionally, but they also do byline journalism. They do branded content and content marketing. They do, white papers and op-eds. They do a mix. And then there are people who are just dedicated professional book ghostwriters and collaborators. That's all they do. One of the things that I think is most interesting, and again, this is very positive for thought leaders in terms of getting access to elite talent, is a lot of published authors themselves are recognizing that they can make quite a good living by also doing collaborative writing. And so we have some really distinguished writers who've written bestsellers under their own name coming to us and saying, hey, I'm interested in doing some ghostwriting on the side. And I think it's partially a reflection that the changes in the publishing industry have driven down the size of advances for nonfiction, serious nonfiction work. So the kind of advances that an author could get on their own are not what they once were. So for them to kind of make their living as a full-time freelance writer, they have to supplement it. And to a lot of these writers who used to primarily just write under their name are subsidizing their own books by doing ghostwriting gigs on the side.
And for these folks, are these mostly fiction writers, or are these nonfiction?
Nonfiction.
Range?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not like, if Mark Twain were among us. Huckleberry Finn gets a decent advance, but he needs to, put on an additional.
You'd be surprised. There is a small but growing market for fiction ghostwriting.
Really?
Yeah. And, one of the most interesting examples of this, and, James Patterson is a genius, he has created a writing factory. Like, he has a whole team of writers where he comes up with his senior leadership with the themes and the storylines for his book, and then he farms it out to writers who are part of his team. But his name is the brand name, and so he is the author, but to some degree the books are ghostwritten by the people who work under him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of obviously there's a little bit of controversy around this, but President Clinton collaborated with James Patterson on a novel. I guess that's right. I've not read it. That was sort of interesting, and obviously in that case it wasn't a ghostwriting. It was more of a partnership.
That's right.
Is that how you?
That would be a collaboration. That's right.
And is that a reflection actually of kind of a shifting marketplace where the idea was that James Patterson has been highly successful selling these thrillers? I'm familiar with them for like the supermarket checkout line, but then you add Bill Clinton's prestige and star power, that's going to help goose sales. Was that sort of the thought process behind that, or just
I think so.
Maybe they're friends and they've got a story to tell together?
Yeah, I think it's probably more the former. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the great things about what the internet has done is not just making things more transparent, but the ability to share and collaborate over a distance is revolutionizing storytelling, right? And you're seeing it in books, so like, you're having people who are in different parts of the world, but you see it with music in particular, right?
I was about to say, yeah.
So many artists, like, they share files, they never in the same studio, and they trade tracks, and then the producer melds it together.
Yeah, and in the network, we live in Google Drive, and so there are plenty of times where we're all working on a document, and while we often sit in the same room, it doesn't have to be the case. We have a couple questions. I want to get to them so we can jump back into this. I want to be mindful of people's time. Our friend Kate over at the Annie E. Casey Foundation asks, how do philanthropic thought leaders successfully get their books to target audiences? Do books make an impact in this age of visuals and brief bites of information? So why a book in the age of Twitter?
I would say because there's so much more content and noise out there, that books are more valuable than ever right now. Because
you rather own the nightstand than the phone? Is that
I think that's partially it, but I think it's more about people look at Twitter and they look at social media and people posting Instagram pictures of their dinner, right? And again, nothing wrong with that, but there's a lot of trivial, casual content being shared out there. And when you take the time to write a book, it's seen as a commitment and it's seen as something serious. And more, particularly when it comes to the serious nonfiction we're talking about, it's the channel that people use when they have really something important to say. Mm-hmm. And so I think the symbolism matters a lot in that you're taking the time to accumulate your thoughts and tell a story and say something holistic that signals to readers that this is something worth paying attention to.
So let's say, just game with that a little bit with me. You're Patrick McCarthy. Kate works with Mr. McCarthy at the Annie Casey Foundation, and he works on a number of really pressing issues, particularly around kids and the welfare of children in America. How does he write a book that finds an audience that's interested in that subject matter? Those could be social workers, could be teachers, could be folks in PTAs, parents, obviously. There's a whole folks in the criminal justice system. There's any number of different folks out there, potential audiences for what they're working on. And how do they, if they wrote a book, absent, the home run is the New York Times bestseller, how do you find your way into the conversations with those folks and onto their nightstand or into their long read pile?
Well, we're going to skip to the end of the presentation.
Yes, I know we're going to get there.
No, it's fine. It's one of the most important points, and we can reiterate it towards the end. But one of the biggest mistakes that authors make is to think about publicity and marketing after the book comes out. By that time, you've lost the battle, right? The best time to start this is before you've even written the book, right? Is to be thinking, okay, how do I connect with the audience? How do I start building a profile and credibility with them and get them interested in my ideas? It used to be, before the internet, right, you hoarded all of your content and your ideas until you put the book out there because you didn't want to kind of give away the milk for free. Mm-hmm. The internet has changed that and totally flipped the script. And now, increasingly, the strategy that authors, and particularly thought leaders, are doing is they're chunking out their content ahead of the book. We call it seeding the garden, right? You're starting to kind of put ideas out there, get more traction, get more credibility.
Lewis does this all the time through Vanity Fair.
That's right.
There have been pieces like the Anthony Bourdain, who just recently passed, unfortunately, started his Kitchen Confidential book with a piece in the New Yorker.
Yeah. So, and one of the most exciting things about digital platforms is you can, in essence, do beta testing of your ideas, right? Because it's not a static thing that you're just publishing content, right? Mm-hmm. More and more people are having conversations. And so by putting the content out there and inviting your audience to comment on it, you're basically crowdsourcing the best thinking of your community before you've written the book. And then the book can then leverage those insights in a way that makes your book, that much better, and also will be that much more resonant with your audience because they will see that their voice is somewhat reflected in what's in those pages of those books.
And I would suggest to you, I don't know that that's true just externally. I think there's also an internal element. We I'll share this with you afterwards, but in the first ever issue of Change Agent, the network's journal that we produce for folks working in comms for good, our colleague Neil Coleman wrote a piece about a book project that he'd done with Judith Rodin, who at the time was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And one of the big takeaways they had, which I think surprised them, was that one of the biggest wins for them was getting, it's a fancy word, but alignment internally. Yes. That suddenly they've been gathering stories from people inside the foundation, and it permeated everybody in the foundation. It also codified some of these ideas so that even within the organization, when they talked about, in this case it was a book about resilience, they had a book they could hand to any new hire that they could share with their board and others and said, when we're talking about this, this is the big idea that we're driving at. And the process of gathering all the string necessary to put that book together helped people within the organization realize that perhaps they hadn't talked to one another, but it was the occasion that put people at the table talking to one another, which is a really highly valuable thing that even before they got to the finish line had tremendous value for them.
Absolutely. Another platform that people use to kind of stoke interest in the book is Kickstarter and crowdfunding platforms like it, right? Is you start putting the ideas and you start teasing interest to say the book's coming in 6 months, and encouraging people to pre-order it. It creates a certain amount of engagement. It also could potentially help you offset some of the costs of hiring a ghostwriter. Mm-hmm. But at a minimum, it builds some anticipation, right? And you sort of kind of allows you to identify your market ahead of time.
So our friend Jenny Oldham from Nashville, we're going to take this question, guys, and we're going to jump back into it. We'll take a few more along the way. Jenny says, do you have examples of foundations who have successfully published books? And so the one I just mentioned, the Judith Rodin book was called Resilience, came out of the Rockefeller Foundation. But are there any others? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can you think of another foundation leader who's published something fairly recently that was
that's a good question.
I guess visible, or one of the measures of success was a big idea was driven forward? And Jenny, I'm happy to offline send you the link to the Neil Coleman piece that he wrote.
Not off the top of my head, unfortunately, but I do know that it is increasingly common.
And I'll add a little bit of data here that I think speaks to this. So a couple of years ago now, but I think it's still relevant, Independent Sector did a really big survey of both folks who identify across the political spectrum, right? About 2,000 people, Republicans and Democrats alike, progressives and conservatives. And they asked them, what do you think about folks working in the social sector, so specifically in foundations and nonprofits? And what they found was, and this shouldn't really surprise anyone, I suppose, but that 75% of Americans had a favorable view of foundations and nonprofits and saw them as constructive, positive forces for good in society. Well, the 75% is great, right? The really extraordinary thing, though, is that Congress is at below 20%, right? Most folks in the business community are below 20%. There just aren't a lot of institutions in our society. This is a fundamental problem with just sort of the decline of trust in institutions. Most folks can't vote 75%. But the really interesting thing was what they found after they asked that question, which was that 85% of these people that they spoke to, 85% wanted to hear more from foundations and nonprofits. They were interested in hearing what they have to say. To me, that suggests there's a market out there.
Yes. I was just looking up to see, trying to remember if Lorene Powell-Jobs from the Emerson Collective recently published a book, I believe.
There was just a big piece, I think you're right, and there was just a big profile piece of her in the Post. So if she hasn't published it, that may be a precedent what's coming.
Yeah.
Shall we move ahead? I want to be mindful of our time.
Yeah, sure. All right, so primer number one was on the ghostwriting market. Primer number two is kind of getting a better understanding of the evolution of the publishing industry, okay? So, the traditional publishing model is still alive and well, and that's the thing that I think most people are familiar with, right? You get an agent, you submit a proposal, a trade publisher, Random House, Simon & Schuster, if they're interested and they see an audience for it, they buy the property, they give you an advance against future earnings, and then if the book earns back in advance, the author starts getting some royalties, okay? That model still works well for some people, right? But increasingly, the publishing industry has started outsourcing the marketing and sales to authors, right? They've contracted. They're trying to get slimmer. They don't do nearly the amount of PR and marketing support internally. They don't edit nearly as much as they used to. And because of that, there's now more and more of an expectation of the author to have a pre-existing platform and to be able to sell books on their own. So that means that the bar has become even higher for nonfiction authors, particularly thought leadership authors, to be able to demonstrate I can sell books myself, okay? So that's the bad news. The good news is the self-publishing industry, which I'm using as an umbrella term to cover all kinds of non-traditional models, is exploding. It's evolving. It's getting much more sophisticated, diversified, and more can compete with traditional publishers and their ability to produce beautiful books, to get them into bookstores, and most importantly, to get visibility and impact. And that's a great thing for the community that the network's dealing with in terms of people who may not have the resources to be on television all the time, have lots of speaking opportunities because you're actually doing the work of saving the planet or whatever the mission is. And so in cases like that, there are now opportunities to publish that never existed before. But with that becomes a challenge for the authors to figure out, okay, there's this new marketplace. How do I find my place there? How do I find the platform and the publisher and the resources I need to do that? I skipped ahead a little bit, but from the slides, and apologize, Tristan. One of the advantages that still exists with traditional publishing is the legitimacy that comes with it, and what I say is the access to elites, right? So if you're trying to have your book covered by NPR or reviewed by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, there's still a substantial advantage of going with traditional publishing. They have a direct pipeline into these outlets. They have the credibility. And so again, if your goal is to get real visibility among elites, then aspiring towards traditional publishing probably is important to you. And that goes to this question of sort of like figuring out what your goals are. But part of the challenge is,
are we on the right slide? Sorry, I just want to make sure we're.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll talk a little bit more about the self-publishing marketplace. Again, it's become totally democratized. And there's lots of different options from, Amazon has this create space where you can upload digital files, do print on demand, you can publish a book for a few $1,000s. And then you go to the other extreme, you have Forbes, which started its own imprint for business leaders, primarily CEOs. It's sort of the Rolls Royce now of what we call hybrid publishing, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute, where they have, top of the line production, distribution. You get direct access to the Forbes website, their audience, newsletter, all this stuff, but the costs run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? So there's this huge range, right? Figuring out is like where your book and your resource and your budget fit into all that is kind of, and we'll get to that a little bit in terms of talking about the business plan. So the idea of a hybrid publisher, and one of the reasons why I think it's the best option for thought leaders is it is the closest approximation to a traditional publisher in this new innovative landscape. Same kind of production and design, quality, same level of editorial support, distribution to bookstores. The difference is the economic model. So rather than the traditional publisher, which will buy your book, in this case, you're paying the hybrid publisher upfront for the production cost and distribution cost. The upside to that is that you maintain total control of the process. You get to choose the title, and you capture almost all the revenue that comes from the sale of the book. And not least of all, you have the flexibility to publish on your time frame, all right? The downside, of course, is that because you have to front some of the costs, you have to have capital to invest in it. And then secondly, another disadvantage is just that because there's still a legitimacy question with non-traditional publishers, you're going to be fighting that, right? And then the practical consideration is you don't have that pipeline into elites, into the book reviewers, into national media outlets. So you have to be in a position to then be creative and most likely invest resources in hiring your own publicists and marketing support to get your book noticed.
Gotcha. So you're swimming uphill against Random House if you go in this direction.
Yes, but then this gets to the question of your goals, right? Mm-hmm. So if your goal is to create a book that's going to reflect well on you, and you have the resources, whether it's internal resources, so you have great connectivity with your community, and you have the ability through your newsletter to call attention to the book, that may be enough. And in a case like that, having the flexibility and the control over the process may be absolutely the right solution. So I did gloss over kind of a third way in between big traditional trade publishers and hybrid publishers, and that's this growing legion of small independent presses, which increasingly are a good option for thought leaders because you get the legitimacy of traditional publishing without having necessarily to go out and get an agent, clear the bar of pleasing some third-party gatekeeper and them seeing a path to making a lot of money off of your book. And for a lot of people working in the nonprofit space, for advocacy organizations, for foundations who have an audience, the small independent presses, because of their cost structure, are in a much better position to take a gamble on a book like that.
And when you say a small independent press, give me an example. Are we talking about, like, obviously we're in Washington, D.C., so the one that jumps immediately to mind is, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation here, so you have to correct me, but Regnery, right, which is a conservative imprint.
That's right.
And they know their audience, and they produce books regularly from any number of different folks. with the idea of reaching a very specific audience.
Yeah.
It's almost like a record label. You know what those books are going to be about.
Yes.
Is that the same sort of idea?
Yes. So there's 4 in particular that I would recommend to people listening to check out because I think they're particularly relevant to the advocacy and nonprofit world. So one is the kind of the progressive version of Regnery is the New Press, which really puts out some terrific books that win national awards, really do influence the debate. I think one of the best examples of that was The New Jim Crow. And if I'm remembering right, it was, what's the name of the woman author? I'll have to think of it later. But like that was a big book that won a National Book Award. And then there's Haymarket, which really specializes in personal improvement, spirituality, health and wellness. There's the Chicago Review Press, which does a lot of books around politics, economics, in the public affairs space. And then there's the Feminist Press, which has been around for several years and is, really esteemed when it comes to issues around gender equality, reproductive rights, things like that.
Okay. And are all these East Coast based, or are they scattered throughout? Obviously, Chicago, I would presume, is in Chicago.
Yes, they are scattered, but because publishing has been predominantly in East Coast, the ones that have been around a while and are established tend to be in the Northeast. But as things are spreading, there's more and more that are popping up around the country, and even in Canada and other English-speaking places.
Okay. And what do we have here? The traditional model, independent publishers. We just went through this. What do we have next?
I can throw out a few examples of hybrid publishers. I mentioned Forbes. There's a great group down in Texas called the Greenleaf Book Group, which publishes a lot of books from business leaders and thought leaders. There's a kind of a hybrid corollary of the feminist press called She Writes Press in the Bay Area. It's a woman named Brooke Warner who's doing some really interesting, innovative things to empower women authors. And then there's one right here in DC called Mascot Books, which is starting to up its game and diversify and branch out into doing more kind of politics and thought leadership books. After that very quick overview of those 2 markets, right? So I want to kind of get into the
landscape, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth acknowledging. It's just a lot different than it used to be.
Yes. Bottom line, though, I'm a big evangelist for the democratization of publishing, and that it's still in transition, and there's still some rough patches, and there's still some less than ethical players in the self and custom publishing, hybrid publishing marketplace. But it's changing rapidly, and it's getting much more professionalized, legitimized, and you're starting to see more and more big brand name authors, people like Seth Godin, right, who's probably one of the, I would say, top 10 influencers in the country right now, publishing on their own because they recognize, right, there's so many more advantages, both in terms of autonomy, the cost structure, the return on investment, and they can buy the services that a traditional publisher uses, and you get to maintain, the flexibility and the autonomy that comes with publishing on your own. So now it's I want to kind of quickly run through some of the kind of ways that you're going to evaluate what's the right path for you, right? So you've made a decision, the book is the right thing for you. You've done your market research, you have a sense of what the marketplace is like. Then it's time to kind of write your business plan, as I like to say, okay? And then for this process, I start with what I call the 6 no's. These are the things you need to know about your situation before you start spending money, right? So number 1 is know your product, okay? Now, it's obvious the book is a product, okay? But if your goal isn't to sell a lot of books, but to use the book as a means to an end, then the product may in the end be the cause that the book is trying to advance. It could be the author is the product, and the book is primarily to create a platform for the author to get better known. Okay.
I often say that foundations and nonprofits at their core are in the ideas business, right? The way that they move those ideas out into the world and see them realized, there's lots of pieces to that, but the fundamental core is We should be paying attention to climate change. We should be lifting up the arts. We should be eradicating disease. Those are big ideas, and that's what animates these organizations. And books are another vehicle to move those ideas forward.
Second, know your audience, right? Who's likely to be interested in this book, and who do you want to reach? Okay. Third, know your competition, right? So before you're going to go out to the marketplace with this new pop-up business, it's good to know what similar books by similar authors have been written in, say, the last 2 or 3 years. And then to figure out, okay, how do I stack up against these other authors, and how can my book be distinctive? This is particularly relevant if you're going to a traditional publisher, right? Because one of the first questions they're going to ask is, well, wasn't there just another book about this like last year, and it sold 5,000 copies? Why am I going to buy your book, right? You have to be prepared to be able to answer that question if you're going to try and convince a traditional publisher to buy your book. Number 4, know your standing, okay? This goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of your expectations about publishing a Times bestseller. It's important to know sort of like where you are in your ecosystem, what your stature level is, what your audience is, your ability to connect with them, how many people do you have in your newsletter, what's your Twitter following, what's your ability to get a book and a set of ideas in front of people. Number 5, which relates to knowing your standing, is knowing your limitations, right? A big part of that is question of function of time, okay? And that will factor into your decision is, do you hire a ghostwriter or collaborator? Can I write this book on my own, or am I going to need help, okay? And number 6, and it's something that you have to think about and it relates to any business, is knowing your budget, right? What are you prepared to invest financially in the success of this pop-up business? There's no one right answer to that, but it's all going to tie back to your goals, right? So if your goal is to have, massive press coverage of this book and be able to do a book tour, if you're either going to then have to invest in ramping up your profile and getting a traditional publishing deal, or you're going to have to invest a lot in hiring PR and marketing support on your own if you're going to go with a hybrid publisher to get your book noticed, okay? So then there's the question of, after you've gone through this and you have your business plan, right, your executional capacity, what resources do you need to stand up your business, okay? And I'm breaking this down into kind of 3 general categories: writing, publishing, and promoting, right? You're creating the product and writing the book, getting the product to market, that's your publishing path, and then you're making consumers aware of the book, making readers aware, okay? So when you're thinking about choosing a ghostwriter, right, and figuring out how you're going to create the manuscript, again, just to reiterate, the author's bandwidth is a big consideration. And then you're thinking about, okay, do I need a pure writer? Do I need someone who's going to be more of a thought partner? Do I need an editor and a strategist? Those are sort of 3 of, I think, the main categories you're thinking about. And then, let's go
down the rabbit hole a little bit. Let's just talk about the classic ghostwriter. So I'm going to pick on Kate for a quick minute because it's top of mind. So let's just say this is totally imaginary, everybody, apocryphal, or just in the vivid imagining. Patrick McCarthy wants to write a book, but he's running the Annie Casey Foundation. He's really busy. So the team at Annie Casey and Mr. McCarthy and folks on his board come together and say, we think this is a valuable thing to do. We're going to hire a ghostwriter. We've already got an idea of our audience. We've run through all the tests that you sort of put forward here. And then the ghostwriter does what? Do they just come in and do interviews? Do they do independent research? Are they off working in Saskatchewan somewhere for 6 months and come back with a fully formed book with the title and crayon and everything? Or tell me kind of how that process works.
There's no one set formula. The best thing I can say is a lot of it will flow from the work style and the preferences of the author, okay? And then the best collaborators, the best ghostwriters adapt like chameleons to the circumstance.
Gotcha.
But that said, the best relationships tend to work where there's a baseline of trust at the beginning, right? That the author believes that the writer has the best interest at heart. They get their voice. They're in tune with the purpose of the book, and that then creates the right context for the writer to work somewhat independently with the author having confidence that they're going to be able to bring back content that is, if not, perfectly aligned with their voice, is close. But a lot of it does require interviews at the front end, spending a lot of time at the beginning. One of the tricks that a lot of ghostwriters use, which is very similar to what I did when I learned how to be a speechwriter, is you spend time listening to the author speaking in public settings and in private settings, right? So you get a sense for, what their public voice is, what their private voice is, the words they use, the rhythm of their, how they speak, right? That makes a big difference in allowing the writer to capture the voice. And then to some degree, what the ghostwriter actually does will be driven in part by what institutional resources the author has, right? So if they have a large organization and a team that can do research, that can do interviews for them, then the writer will most likely be focused on synthesizing that raw material and weaving the narrative. However, if it's a small organization and they don't have those resources, more often than not, the author will lean on the collaborator to do the interviews, to do the research, to acquire the string as well as weave it into gold.
Okay, thank you.
So just some other things and just think about in terms of hiring the ghostwriter is, writing style, like reviewing their samples to make sure that they're going to be a good match with the author's, tone, and that's one of the things that when we're dealing with clients, one of the first things we ask them is, who are some authors that you admire, right? Or some magazines, right? So a lot of the thought leaders, like one of the first things they say is, I love The Economist. I want someone who can write like The Economist. That's a fairly common frame of reference. So that's important to look at. Another question that is a practical one is geography, right? So we're going through this right now with one client who's like, I want to meet with my writer on a regular basis. I want them to kind of soak up the atmosphere of where I work. And so it's really important to them to have someone who's located in the same metro areas as them. That's the exception. In most cases, the authors are very comfortable working remotely after they've developed that initial baseline of trust. But again, knowing that and knowing how you function is really important. Another big consideration is cost, right? Is some of our clients come to us and say, I want the best of the best New York Times bestsellers on their resume, and I'm willing to pay whatever it takes. And then there's other people who sort of, we walk them through the cost structure of the market, and they say, I want someone who's really accomplished and has written books for major publishers, but I have a ceiling. And then there's other people, and I would imagine in this community, cost is going to be a major consideration, is I can only spend $40,000 or $50,000. And then, so knowing that when you're going in, you're having those parameters set is going to make your search much, much more efficient. And then the last and most important consideration in choosing a ghostwriter is chemistry, right? You brought up Peggy Noonan, and I use this example a lot. Peggy Noonan is regarded as one of the best speechwriters of her generation. She would charge, I heard through the grapevine, something like $50,000 to write a speech.
And this is just to remind people, Peggy Noonan became well known for being the principal speechwriter for Ronald Reagan when he was president.
Ronald Reagan and then President Bush.
Oh, was she? Okay, didn't know she stayed on. Okay.
So not many people know this, but she went to work for Mitt Romney in 2011 when he was gearing up to run in the primaries for the Republican nomination for president. I think she lasted maybe 2 or 3 months, all right, and then she got fired. Now, does that mean she's a bad speechwriter? No. It means that she and Romney didn't have the connection and what I call the click factor that was going to be necessary for them to have a good collaboration, right, a good relationship. Mm-hmm. So one of the most important things before you sign a contract, before you make that decision to move forward, is making sure that you're comfortable with your writing partner, that they get you, that you're going to trust them, you're going to have confidence in them. That is by far more important than credentials, experience, and how many New York Times bestsellers they have on their list.
That makes sense, right? And that's true. I mean, we were talking earlier about music, and I'm sure it would apply to sports too. Chemistry is everything.
How are we doing on time?
You're starting to run short on time. So
okay.
Let's see what we can get to with the remaining time that we have.
Okay. Well, on the promotion side, we already kind of covered what I think is the key takeaway. So just in terms of publishing, a lot of this is going to come down to, you come to a fork in the road. Am I going to try and pursue traditional publishing or some variation of self-publishing? And most likely for thought leaders, it's going to be a hybrid publisher. The key factors to be thinking is sort of, again, your goals, right? And if your goal, and then, for some people, and maybe they actually do want to sell books. That's important. They want to generate revenue from the project. In that case, traditional publisher is going to still be your best bet. The author's needs, right? So if, the author's going to feel more comfortable with the support system and having very little risk and having to do very little themselves, then a traditional publisher is going to be advantageous. But if you've got a good team around you that's able to kind of manage this pop-up business on their own and is more entrepreneurial and wants to have that control, then a hybrid publisher may be a better option. And then a big question is timing, right? Traditional publishing, even with all the advances in technology, is still stuck in this archaic scheduling system where books often are released 9 to 12 months after the manuscript is turned in, right? And for many thought leaders who are trying to be topical and move quickly and seize opportunities, that publishing schedule just doesn't work, right? So if you're trying to crash out a book for 6 and 9 months, then traditional publishing really is almost a non-starter for you. And some variation of self or hybrid publishing is going to be your best bet. And then the other question is scalability, right? If you don't have a large platform, your book is dealing with a very niche subject, you're not going to be able to convince an agent to represent you and a traditional publisher to buy your book. It's important to kind of own that at the beginning of the process and just recognize that that path may not just even be open to you, rather than spend a lot of time chasing after something just because, of the prestige factor. I will stop there. And if there are any other questions.
Yes, there's a couple of questions. So Jessica asked us, is it useful to get an agent on top of securing a publisher, or maybe this is a chicken and egg thing, or is an agent really better at the front end of the project?
Absolutely, and think about the sequencing of getting an agent, right? So if you're going to try and go to a traditional publisher, unless you have a direct pipeline to someone, or you're going to try and approach a small independent press, right? So you're thinking about a major trade publisher, they will only take submissions from agents, right? So it's sort of, kind of a, preset path you have to take. You're going to have to work through an agent. And ideally, to have an agent at the front end of the process to help you shape a proposal and shape your pitch to a publisher is really, really valuable, because what inevitably happens in many cases is, we see this with some of our clients, they'll hire a writer or they'll start doing a proposal on their own. They'll bring it to an agent, and the agent said, oh, I love your story, or you've got some great ideas in here, but the proposal's a mess, right? And we're going to have to completely, revamp it. And just in terms of cost and efficiency, you're so much better off having the agent in there to leverage their expertise, their understanding of the marketplace, and how to position the book to sell, shape the proposal at the front end.
So if I'm just understanding the sequence, forgive me if I'm a bit dense today, but it sounds like it's the sequence is author or thought leader, right? Then agent, then ghostwriter, then publishing house, or have I got that in somehow?
That is a perfectly fine sequence. Oftentimes what we're doing with our clients is after they've made that threshold decision, I'm going to create this business. I'm going to create this pop-up business, and before they get to a publisher, they'll work on parallel tracks in securing an agent and securing a writer.
Gotcha.
Because one of the things that often works really well is to be able to approach an agent not with a full-fledged proposal, which can be 50 to 70 pages, but a short synopsis. So you're giving them something that the hook of the book is evident to them. It's really well written, that will open the doors for them. And by having a skilled writer on board before you start approaching agents, but not doing the proposal until you have an agent on board tends to make
more efficient.
Absolutely. You tend to get the best results.
So I know a couple of folks on the phone were asking about examples of foundations who had written books. And I know that's not necessarily your expertise, but our friend Robert Shallett came through with, as he always does, really fantastic idea. Thank you, sir. He suggested Stanford Social Innovation Review actually has a section of their print journal. I believe it's available online as well. But in the printed version of Stanford Social Innovation Review, they actually highlight some of the big books out in the sector. And so that's always going to be a great place to look to see what others are doing, and that might help to inform some of your thinking. It'll probably also, I would think, and I could use your help here, Dan, is it will help you think through some of the publishers who are putting those books out, because it may be that there's academic presses and others who are possibly working in sort of a very specialized sector like philanthropy.
Yes.
And so you could look there. There's a classic book that Robert points to by Joel, I'm going to pronounce this correctly, is Rose. It's called The Insider's Guide to Grant Making. It was written when he was program officer at the Kellogg Foundation. The other question we have before we let you go, Dan, you've been really generous with your time, is Patricia Carroll asks, could you name the names of the small independent presses that you gave out there? So, for example, you said the New Press, and there were a few others. Can you run through those again?
New Press, which is New York, Haymarket, Chicago Review Press, in Chicago, and then the Feminist Press, which is also based in, I believe it's based in New York as well.
We still have Robert with us, and he said Sage is a big nonprofit publisher. Are they based also in New York City, or where are they located?
I believe they are, because if I remember correctly, they're connected with Russell Sage.
Could be. Hopefully he's typing it. If any of it, Robert has fact checker. Yeah, we have some help on the back end. Thank you, Dan, very, very, very much. I want to thank everybody for your time. Really grateful for giving us the hour. I've certainly learned a ton. It's really interesting to hear kind of how the sausage is made. Because I think for most of us, you walk into the bookstore, or frankly, sometimes you walk into the Costco, and there are books to be had, and you don't necessarily know from whence they came or all the different things. But I love the idea of thinking of this as a pop-up business because it makes all the sense in the world. There is just a tremendous amount of time, energy, and commitment, and it really does take a village to get from here to there.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope this was useful, and I look forward to expanding on this at the ComNet conference in October.
Well, that's right. So that's also worth noting, guys. If you haven't signed up, you may have gotten a note if you're a member from me kind of scolding you. We are running really short on tickets, and partly one of the reasons is because Dan is going to be with us in San Francisco running a workshop. So if this is interesting to you, but you need a little bit more time, a little bit more guidance, you're going to get a chance to do a really focused 2-hour-long workshop with Dan talking about this idea of moving an idea or moving your boss or yourself from someone with a good idea to published author. So more on that in San Francisco. Thanks, everybody. Before you jump off, please take the survey because we always like to know how to make these better for you. And we will be back in very, very soon. I think we're actually doing something with the 15-minute group. Is that next week, Tristan? Okay, so we've got another webinar next week talking about how to do amazing media appearances with Ann Dickerson and the team from the 15-minute media group. All right, talk to you all soon. Thanks.